The American Civil War was fought from 1861 to 1865, and it is one of the most significant events in American history that took the lives of 620,000 Americans. It was a conflict that pitted the Union States, the North, against the Confederacy, the South, with slavery being the primary cause of the divide between the two sides. The Union sought to preserve the Union and abolish slavery, while the Confederacy sought to maintain their way of life, which included slavery. To understand the historical context of the American Civil War, it's important to look at the events leading up to the conflict. The roots of the Civil War can be traced back to the founding of the United States and the issue of slavery. In the late 1700s, the northern states began to abolish slavery, while the southern states continued to rely on the institution for their economy. This created a divide between the North and South that would continue to widen in the decades leading up to the Civil War. As the country expanded westward, the debate over whether to allow slavery in the new territories intensified. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state, but it also established a boundary that prohibited slavery in territories north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to solve the issue of slavery in the territories by allowing popular sovereignty, which meant that the settlers in the territory could decide whether or not to allow slavery. However, this only led to more tension, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed in Kansas, leading to the nickname Bleeding Kansas. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 was a turning point in the conflict. Lincoln was anti-slavery and had promised to stop the spread of slavery to new territories. This led to 7 southern states seceding from the Union and forming the Confederacy, with more states following soon after. The Confederate states believed that they had the right to secede from the Union, citing the idea of states' rights. The Union, however, believed that secession was illegal and that the United States was a perpetual union. Let's follow the chronological order and look back into the 5 lasting years of this bloody war. Before we get started, please subscribe to our channel. Thank you. 1861. In 1861, tensions between the North and South had reached a boiling point. The country was divided, and the fate of the Union hung in the balance. It all began on April 12, when Confederate forces launched a surprise attack on Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The attack was swift and brutal, resulting in the capture of the fort and sparking the beginning of the Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln knew that he had to act fast if he wanted to preserve the Union. Just 4 days after the attack on Fort Sumter, he made a bold move and called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. The call was met with mixed reactions, with some eager to fight for the Union and others vehemently opposed to the idea of war. As the conflict escalated, more states began to secede from the Union. On May 20th, North Carolina became the 10th state to secede, further solidifying the Confederacy's hold on the South. The Union, however, was not going down without a fight. On July 21, 1861, Union and Confederate forces clashed in what would be the first major battle of the war, the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas. The Union forces were led by General Irvin McDowell, and Confederate forces, led by General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard. The Union Army, which had recently been mobilized, was inexperienced and poorly trained. McDowell hoped to quickly defeat the Confederates and march on to the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. However, the Confederate forces were better prepared and more experienced, having been trained at the Virginia Military Institute and other Southern military schools. The battle began with an early morning Union assault on the Confederate left flank, but the Confederates were able to hold their ground and eventually launch a counterattack. Confederate reinforcements arrived by rail, which gave them a crucial advantage, and the Union forces were forced to retreat in disarray. After the Confederate victory in this battle, it was a clear sign that the war would not be won easily, and that the Union would have to fight hard to preserve its existence. The attack on Fort Sumter and the events that followed would set the stage for 4 long years of brutal warfare, pitting brother against brother and tearing the nation apart. 1862. In 1862, the Civil War was in full swing. The Union had already experienced both victory and defeat, but they were determined to press on and bring an end to the conflict that had torn the nation apart. In February, Union forces launched a successful campaign to capture Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee under the rule of General Ulysses S. Grant. This was a significant victory, as it gave the Union control of the Cumberland River and opened up a pathway into the heart of the Confederacy. The Battle of Shiloh, also known as the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, took place in April, and it was a brutal affair with heavy casualties on both sides. The Union emerged victorious, but the cost was high. It was clear that the war would not be won easily, and both sides were prepared to fight to the bitter end. June 1 saw Robert Edward Lee assuming command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. It was a significant moment in the war, as Lee was a brilliant strategist who would go on to lead the Confederate forces to some of their most impressive victories. In August, the Second Battle of Bull Run, also known as Second Manassas, took place. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert Edward Lee, won a decisive victory over the Union Army of Virginia, commanded by General John Pope. The battle was fought on the same ground as the First Battle of Bull Run, First Battle of Manassas, which had taken place just over a year earlier. The battle began when Confederate troops attacked Union soldiers who were guarding a railroad junction at Manassas. The fighting was intense and lasted for 3 days, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. On the second day of the battle, Confederate General Stonewall Jackson launched a surprise attack on the Union flank, causing chaos and confusion among the Union troops. This enabled Lee's army to break through the Union lines and force them to retreat. But the Union would not be deterred. On September 17th, the Battle of Antietam, also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, took place in Maryland. It was the first major battle fought on Union soil and remains the single bloodiest day in American military history, with over 22,000 casualties. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert Edward Lee, had invaded Maryland in the hopes of gaining support from Marylanders sympathetic to the Confederacy, as well as to try to convince European powers to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. The Union Army of the Potomac, led by General George Brinton McClellan, caught up with Lee's army at Antietam Creek, where they engaged in a fierce battle that lasted from dawn until dusk. The battle was characterized by heavy fighting in a number of different locations, including the cornfield, the sunken road, and Burnside's bridge. Despite being outnumbered, Lee's army held its ground against the Union forces until late afternoon, when Union General Ambrose Burnside was able to cross the creek and attack the Confederate right flank. This forced Lee to retreat back into Virginia, effectively ending his invasion of Maryland. The year of 1862 ended with the Battle of Fredericksburg in Virginia. The Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by General Ambrose Burnside, was attempting to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Burnside's army crossed the Rappahannock River and attacked the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert Edward Lee, which was entrenched on high ground behind a stone wall on Marye's Heights. The The Union forces were met with intense Confederate fire and suffered heavy losses as they attempted to cross an open field and capture the Confederate position. Despite numerous attempts, the Union forces were unable to break through the Confederate lines, and the battle ended in a resounding Confederate victory. Union casualties numbered around 12,000, while Confederate losses were around 5,000. This battle had a lasting impact on the area, as the stone wall at Marye's Heights became known as the Wall of the Dead due to the large number of Union soldiers who died while attempting to scale it. The battlefield is now preserved as Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. 1863. In 1863, the Civil War had already been raging for 2 long and bloody years. The nation was weary and divided, and the Union was struggling to gain the upper hand in the conflict. On January 1st, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a landmark moment in American history. The proclamation declared all slaves in Confederate-held territory to be free, and it signaled a significant shift in the Union's goals for the war. It was a bold move, and one that would have far-reaching consequences for the nation. In May, the Battle of Chancellorsville took place in Virginia. The Union Army of the Potomac was under the command of Major General Joseph Hooker, and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Robert Edward Lee. Despite having superior numbers, Hooker was outmaneuvered by Lee and suffered a crushing defeat. Lee, with only half the number of soldiers as Hooker, divided his forces and attacked the Union Army from 3 sides. The Confederate forces launched a surprise attack against the Union right flank on May 2nd, routing the Union troops and causing them to retreat in disarray. During the battle, Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own troops and died several days later. Despite this loss, Lee was able to secure a stunning victory, capturing more than 5,000 Union troops and forcing the rest to retreat. In July, the Battle of Gettysburg took place in Pennsylvania, and it was a turning point in the war. The Union emerged victorious, dealing a significant blow to the Confederate forces and securing a crucial victory on Northern soil. The battle was one of the deadliest of the war, with casualties numbering in the tens of thousands. On November 19th, President Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, a famous speech that honored the dead of the battle and called for the nation to come together in the face of adversity. It was a powerful moment in American history, and the speech has become one of the most famous in the nation's history. 1864. In 1864, and the Civil War had been raging for over 3 years. The Union was determined to bring an end to the conflict, but the Confederacy was equally determined to defend their way of life. The Battle of the Wilderness marked the start of the Overland Campaign, a brutal series of battles that would continue throughout the summer. The battle was fought from May 5 to 7, 1864. The Union Army, commanded by General Ulysses S. Grant, launched an attack against the Confederate Army, led by General Robert Edward Lee. Despite initial successes by the Union forces, they were ultimately unable to break through the Confederate lines, and the battle ended in a stalemate. The Wilderness was a particularly brutal battle, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The thick underbrush and woods made it difficult to see the enemy, and many soldiers were killed or wounded at close range. In June, the Battle of Cold Harbor took place in Virginia from May 31 to June 12, 1864. The Union troops launched a frontal assault on the entrenched Confederate positions at Cold Harbor, resulting in heavy losses for the Union Army. Despite the heavy casualties, General Ulysses S. Grant ordered another assault on June 3, which also failed. It was a costly defeat for the Union, with thousands of soldiers losing their lives in a matter of minutes. The battle was a reminder of the high cost of the war, and it left many wondering if the Union would ever prevail. The Union forces would continue their fight. On September 2nd, they captured Atlanta, Georgia, a significant victory that dealt a blow to the Confederate forces. It was a moment of triumph for the Union, and it gave them hope that the end of the war was within reach. And in November, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman led his march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. It was a daring move, and one that would go down in history as a pivotal moment in the war. As Sherman's troops marched through Georgia, they destroyed Confederate infrastructure, leaving a path of destruction in their wake. The march to the sea was a bold move, and it sent a clear message to the Confederacy that the Union was determined to win the war at any cost. It was a brutal campaign, but it was also one that would ultimately lead to Union victory. 1865. In 1865, the end of the Civil War was finally in sight. But the road to victory was not an easy one, and it was marked by a series of dramatic events that would shape the future of the United States. On April 2nd, Confederate forces evacuated Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. It was a stunning turn of events, and one that signaled the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Just a week later, on April 9th, General Robert Edward Lee surrendered his army to Union General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. It was a moment of reckoning for the Confederate forces, and one that would ultimately lead to the end of the war. But the end of the war was not without its share of tragedy. On April 14th, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer who sought to avenge the Confederacy's defeat. It was a moment of shock and horror for the nation, and it left many wondering what the future would hold. Despite the tragedy of Lincoln's death, the Union forces continued to press forward. On April 26, Confederate General Joseph Edward Johnston surrendered his army to Union General William Tecumseh Sherman in North Carolina. And on May 10, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was captured by Union troops in Georgia, bringing an end to the Confederate leadership. The last battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Palmetto Ranch, took place in Texas on May 23 to 24. It was a small battle, but one that marked the final engagement of the war. And on June 23, the last Confederate troops surrendered in Indian Territory, bringing an end to the conflict. It was a moment of relief and celebration for the Union forces, and it marked the beginning of a new era in American history. The American Civil War was a tumultuous time in American history, marked by division and conflict. The war would last for 4 years, claim the lives of over 600,000 Americans, and have a lasting impact on the course of American history. The Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery, but it also highlighted the divisions between the North and South over economic, social, and political issues. The North was primarily industrial, while the South was primarily agricultural. The North had a larger population and more resources, while the South had a stronger military tradition. The Civil War was a crucial moment in American history that changed the course of the country forever. It ended slavery and preserved the Union, cementing the idea of the United States as one nation. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos on history, politics, and culture.